Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today from Beirut, Kim Ghattas, who is a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a longtime journalist, including with the BBC. Kim, great to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Ivo.
From Washington, D.C., Julian Barnes, national security reporter covering the intelligence community and UFOs. Julian Barnes from the New York Times. Julian, great to have you back.
Thank you so much.
And from London, Philip Stevens, who is the chair of the editorial board and chief political commentator for the Financial Times. Philip, great to have you back as well. Just before we got on the air, Kim, we were just talking about the issues we were going to cover, and you mentioned how the situation politically, economically, socially is in your own country. And while we weren't planning to talk about it, it probably is good for our watchers and viewers and listeners to get a sense of what's happening in Beirut, in particular, because it kind of links into some of the other issues we will discuss. So how dire would you say is the situation today in Lebanon? What is it, 6 months after this terrible explosion and everything that has happened both before and since?
Ivo, thanks so much for asking that question. Lebanon has a way of inserting itself in many conversations, because I do think that, and of course I'm biased because I'm Lebanese, but I do think that a lot of the issues that are at stake in the Middle East, and when the Biden administration talks about governance and accountability and pushing back against kleptocracies and autocracies, a lot of that is exemplified in what Lebanon is going through at the moment. You're right to point out that there was this terrible blast last year at the Beirut port. That was, in essence, the last straw, if you will. It came on top of a pandemic, which is a worldwide event, but those two events for us also came on top of a financial economic collapse, which was kind of impending, but was precipitated by protests, which started in October of 2019. All of that is only getting worse at the moment. We're seeing very long queues at petrol stations. We're seeing pharmacies running out of medication. We're seeing hospitals having to shut down non-emergency procedures because they have to shut down air conditioning in the heat of the summer. Life is really dire. Living conditions for most people in Lebanon have become almost unbearable. 80% there's a 80% inflation, 400% increase in price of foodstuff. Subsidies are going to be lifted because the central bank is running out of foreign reserves to continue supporting these subsidies. UNICEF just put out a report saying that 70% of Lebanon's children are going to bed hungry. Now, you may think that this is just business as usual in Lebanon, but Lebanon was a middle-income country just 18 months ago. So it's really a case study of how a country can be catapulted from being a middle-income country with comfortable middle class to suddenly being a hunger spot. It's not just a local problem. It's not just a Lebanon problem. It's a problem that is connected to a region, to the wider Middle East, because Lebanon is part of this system in the region that includes Iran, for example, which has its proxy militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah, a Shia political party and militia, which is a regional paramilitary force with foot soldiers in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. Lebanon was under occupation by Syria for 30 years until 2005. And what we're seeing today are the dying throes of a system that was put in place when Syria invaded Lebanon in 1990. So it's easy to dismiss Lebanon as just this little country on the Mediterranean that we shouldn't really care about. But I do think that it is essential to look at it. I do think it's essential for the Biden administration to pay attention, not just because we're on the Mediterranean and there is potential for more refugees going to Europe, not just because we sit on the border with Israel and there's potential for cross-border violence with Hezbollah, not only because we sit on the border with Syria and there's a lot of smuggling going on between Lebanon and Syria that includes drugs, which then make their way to Europe, but because it is such a case study in how you move forward with governance, with accountability, with an end to impunity that is so essential to this region. And just a final thought, if I may. A lot of what we're seeing in Lebanon today, I think, is really a result of a new world order put in place, or that began in 1990 after the end of the Cold War, with the liberation of Kuwait, as President Bush, the father, declared at the time. It was a cold order it was a new world order that was built on new freedoms, the liberation of Kuwait at the time, amongst other things, the new freedoms after the Cold War, the new freedoms that were supposed to come from the Madrid Peace Conference, etc. But it was also built on the occupation of Lebanon and the continuation of the rule of the Assad family, extending it from Syria into Lebanon. And to me, that was always a faulty way, an unstable way to build this new order. And I think that 30 years later, we're seeing this crumble most rapidly and most visibly in Lebanon.
Thanks, Kim. It's depressing, but a great short history of where Lebanon is today, and how it got to the place it got. And I was struck by your argument, Philip, about governance and this central challenge of how countries can govern themselves, particularly when there is outside influence. It's easier for bigger countries who are not necessarily influenced from the outside to figure it out, or at least to screw it up themselves. And when you have a country like Lebanon and much of the Middle East, as I think you rightly put it, governance is a real issue, in large part because of the outside influence. And Philip, the administration, and I think the Western world and the G7, when they came together, talk about democracy being easy and important, and the values being important. And yet, what is their answer to the problem of governance, which ultimately is where security and prosperity needs to reside? Without governance, you have neither.
Well, I think we were reminded this week by the death of Donald Rumsfeld about how it was supposed to be. Not that Rumsfeld espoused this doctrine, but I mean, less than 20 years ago, we had an administration in Washington talking about the generational project to bring democracy to the Middle East. And we were going to bring it to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Libya, to Egypt, after the uprising there. And what instead, as you say, we have a series now of failed states, and Lebanon seems to be about to join those failed states. We have Syria, we have Iraq, have Libya. If Lebanon joins, it sort of completes that arc of, and then you have people on the edges competing for influence in them. You have Iran, you have Russia, and you have the West. And in the midst of this, you have a Europe which has never really quite known where it stands in this, except in terms of perhaps providing some assistance, and a United States that wants to leave the Middle East behind. I mean, if it was one clear pillar of the Biden foreign policy, it's let's get out of the Middle East. But the Middle East isn't going to leave the US behind. We can't just stand as spectators and expect these countries to implode in upon themselves and to not feel the consequences. So I fear that we will be dragged back in the West, but I also fear that we don't really have, and I include Europe as much as the United States in this, a strategy for this.
Julian, when you go around and do your reporting in Washington, clearly the Middle East has been displaced as a primary issue of concern. China is taking over as a much more important issue, and yet the governance crises are creating security problems that inevitably, as Philip put it, you may want to leave the Middle East, but the Middle East doesn't leave you, inevitably reverberate. How do you see the administration, and I think not just the administration, Washington sort of working these kinds of issues out? Lebanon is not even on the front pages of your very international newspaper. It's not even in the back pages of the newspaper. And yet, what is happening there is not only a tragedy for the people who live there, which is bad enough, it creates the potential for security and other problems for the United States and the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You put it exactly right. Washington would like nothing more than to focus on China, to do its long delayed Asian pivot. And, that is the long-term problem. That is a long-term challenge. That's what they want to unite everyone around, allies around the world. There is a recognition, though, that as much as you would want to leave the Middle East, that you can't, that the United States bears a responsibility for what has been created, for what is not going right there, and that the Middle East has an uncanny way of dragging the United States back in. So there's some critical reviews going on right now. The Pentagon is doing a force posture review. I'm sure that there are people who would like to take troops out of the Middle East, but every time there's a strike against Iranian-backed militias in Iran, every time Iran does something, every time that there is a humanitarian crisis, there's a reminder of why the U.S. has a presence there. It's just a matter of making sure U.S. actions are for the good, and not making the situation worse. But I think you guys have squared it up exactly right.
And just the other question is, can you do a nuclear deal with Iran? Can the United States get back into the JCPOA and do that deal while ignoring what's happening, partly because of Iranian proxies in the rest of the region? And that big objective of American foreign policy of doing a deal with Iran on the nuclear issue seems to me can't be done outside the context of a broader understanding about what happens in the region.
Well, I think that's why we saw those strikes against the Iranian militias. I mean, as much as the administration wanted to separate the two issues publicly, they need to show that they are taking action against the Iranian proxy groups that they feel are destabilizing the region. And, the Republican critique of any return to the Iran nuclear deal is going to be about Iran's missile programs that are not covered by the deal and about their proxies' bad actions. So I feel like the administration needs to demonstrate that it is not ignoring that issue if it's going to move forward with a renewed participation in the JCPOA.
Kim, I may, jump in here. I
just want to jump in on a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to remember an article that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor of the Biden administration at the White House, wrote just before the Biden administration came into office. It was in Foreign Affairs magazine in January, and it's called America's Opportunity in the Middle East. And he says very clearly that the United States cannot, will not, or should not leave the region outright, but that it should use diplomacy to find leverage and be able to reduce its military presence while safeguarding its interests. So I think downsizing America's or deprioritizing the Middle East for the White House, for someone like Jake Sullivan, means assigning a correct amount of energy rather than allowing the Middle East sort of completely suck you in. So I think we have to be careful not to assume that what they want to do is just walk away, because that doesn't look to me like what they're doing either, and it's not what Jake Sullivan set out in that article. Things change, of course. I would just say two other things as well, picking up on what Philip and Julian just said. I think it's very important after Europe and America's recent experiences with populism and the insurrection on Capitol Hill, to better understand that democracy is a process, and it's a process for everyone. And this is a system that does not just sort of, self-perpetuate. It needs tending to, it needs protection. The institutions don't uphold themselves. They need the right people to uphold these institutions. And, the insurrection on January the 6th was a clear signal of how fragile democracy can be, even in a country like the United States. And so it's important to understand that it's a process everywhere. And it's a process that cannot unfold and cannot bring political maturity in countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Jordan or others if the West is friends with the autocratic rulers of those countries. I know that America has interests, but it has values as well. And so what's important in terms of supporting governance and allowing democratic processes to unfold and political maturation to unfold is to find a better balance. Because to Julian's point, yes, America wants to focus on China, but guess what? The competition with China is also in the Middle East. They're very busy in Iran. They're very busy with the GCC. They're very busy bringing their Belt and Road Initiative to the region. And there are efforts in Lebanon and in Iran to turn away from anything that is American and put Lebanon in the camp of China and Iran and get oil from China and get products from China, etc. That's an opportunity for the United States to see the competition with China as it unfolds in this region as well. And the one thing that America brings to the table that is of interest to the people of this region is something that China does not have. And those are progressive liberal values, which the people of this region are still attached to. Because when dissidents are thrown in jail in any country of this region, they're not calling on China to help them. They're calling on the United States.
Philip, this is a really important point, I think, that Kim is making, and a point you have often made in your own writings, that there is this competition between China and the West, not in military or confrontational terms, but really in value terms. There is something that binds Europe and the United States and its democratic allies in Asia that makes them different from China. And this competition is now playing out in various regions. I think Kim's point that it's playing out in the Middle East, where there are strategic interests, they may be less than they used to be, but in order to win the competition in the right way, you need to engage here. And perhaps that the switch to a more diplomatic, less military focus on the U.S. engagement allows the opportunity for the U.S. and Europe to have a more agreed common strategy for this part of the world. Is that opportunity there? And importantly, do the Europeans see it?
I think the opportunity is there, and I hope that Kim is right I wouldn't at all argue for the US to sort of maintain or increase military engagement, because we've seen over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan that you don't do this stuff with troops. Although I think you have to have the troops and force there as a last resort. My fear is that you won't get this diplomatic push, that you'll basically get people saying, look, we have to deal with China. That's the key sort of point of conflict in this decade and beyond, and that they will leave the Middle East until the crisis becomes unbearable. And I think we're going to talk a little about Ethiopia and Tigray province, and that's what's happened there. We sort of come in when the crisis is absolutely at its worst. But what I don't see is a strategy or an American policy, or indeed a European policy towards Egypt. We have, for example, we have in Sisi there a despotic regime which can hold power for the moment, but at some point that's going to be unsustainable and it's going to break. We don't have any strategy for that. And Lebanon, as we've heard, as you said, it's not mentioned. It doesn't figure. It doesn't figure in the discourse in Europe. What Kim says is horrifying, but it's partly horrifying because no one's talking about it. And Lebanon's still assumed to be this, sort of very difficult and impossible place, but somewhere that somehow holds together and remains a bit of a sort of anchor for the rest. And the fact that it's beginning to splinter, again, I think shows the neglect of Europe and to a degree the United States in this region. We're not building the institutions. We're not saying, okay, we're bringing our troops home, but we're putting in really big efforts into development to counter China, into institution buildings, into support for democratic or pluralist movements in these regions.
Julian, before turning to Ethiopia, let's bring in one other conflict and situation that is top of mind today. The United States withdrew its forces from Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, the same air base where the first significant military U.S. military presence in 2001 was deployed. Philip mentioned, of course, the death of Donald Rumsfeld, who, whatever he might have done before his second stint as Secretary of Defense, will presumably be most remembered for what he did as the second in his second stint. By the way, he was one of my predecessors as U.S. ambassador to NATO. I think that should have been number one on his obituary, but apparently it wasn't. And you spent a lot of time thinking about his obituary. Talk a little bit about the Rumsfeldian view, how that relates to Afghanistan, and where we are today, which is basically leaving a country somewhat improved from over 20 years. You can't not improve things when you put that much effort and money into it. And yet at the brink of a situation not that different from what it might have been in 1990. And how Rumsfeld relates to that.
Yeah, and he is very much, a part of what's going on now, because how he shaped that initial invasion, how he brought us into Iraq, were pretty much some of the key decisions throughout the course of this war. Which is coming to an end. You mentioned this very, sort of moment of troops coming out of Bagram. It was preceded by Scotty Miller, the top commander there, warning about an impending civil war. And so that is the civil war that, Washington is most focused on right now. It bears responsibility for that. It could like to stop it. It doesn't know if it can, because it is done with Afghanistan. Rumsfeld himself is such an interesting figure. And I think that all the obituaries that came out sort of showed, how reflected the fact that America was obsessed with him. He was a star after 9/11 with his pugnacious news conferences. As he dragged us into the Iraq war, as he ignored how Iraq was going south, how he turned the attention away from Afghanistan. He became a focus of that ire. In 2015, in preparation for Wall Street Journal obituary, I interviewed him. So many people would like Donald Rumsfeld to have a little McNamara in him, where he would admit a mistake, where he would suggest that he did something wrong. But that was never his character. It was not his character at the end. He was someone who really believed in his ideas. And he did have some ideas that reshaped the military, right? He made the military a lighter, more deployable force. The ability that the Obama administration had to strike at Osama bin Laden and make that successful was in part because of the military that Donald Rumsfeld made. On the other hand, his views on how to fight a war and what you had to do after that war were wrong. He wanted to be out of Afghanistan. He said after toppling the Taliban, he felt like we should have declared victory and maybe gone. The Bush administration didn't want to do that. It felt it would be abandoning allies. Donald Rumsfeld, when I spoke to him in 2015, brought up this metaphor he loves to talk about the hand on the bicycle seat, that we shouldn't nation build, but we can train a partner military, and you can hold on to that bicycle seat and then let go, and they'll be on their own. He loved the metaphor. It turns out to be completely wrong. It's not how you train a military. Once your hand is off the bicycle seat, it falls apart. We saw that in Iraq when the Iraqi military fell to ISIS in 2014. We're seeing that today with the Afghan military having defeat after defeat as the Taliban pushes its advantage. This idea of a quick invasion and then being done with it doesn't work. And if that was Donald Rumsfeld's big idea, we're paying for it today.
Quick invasion and done with it doesn't work. Quick invasion and staying doesn't work. Not invading also has its problems, particularly if you continue to support power structures that are at the core of the issue. When you look at the last 20 plus years, Afghanistan and the region, how much do you think the problems that we are seeing today are internal, and how much do you think they are because of external forces, including theories about war and intervention that come from somebody like Rumsfeld?
It's a tricky question. It's hard to delineate exactly what starts where. I know that a lot of people sitting in Western capitals will say that it's all about these countries that can't be fixed. These countries over there that have been killing each other, they've been at each other's throats forever. We even heard Joe Biden, when he was still candidate, talk about Afghanistan as a country that will never be a country. But we also heard Biden, as senator at the time, suggest that Iraq should be split in 3. These ideas that come from the outside without recognizing the desire and the will of the country, of these countries' people are problematic, because I'm not saying that you should always sort of sit there and take out the history books and have a long analysis, because sometimes the very distant history is not relevant. The idea that Sunnis and Shias have always been killing each other and therefore they're always going to be killing each other is not quite right either. It's not that simple. It's actually much it's not what this is about in the region at the moment. So it's not intractable. But it's certain that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 opened a Pandora's box and unleashed Iran in the region in a way that we're still trying to recover from. And that is America's doing. Now, do countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia have agency? Are they also contributing to the problem? Absolutely. So I always say that everyone is responsible. We in this region cannot say, oh, it's always America's fault. But America can also not sit there and say, oh, these countries over there, we can't fix them, or let's try, and if it doesn't work, it's their fault. And that I think is a sobering lesson that I hope leaders in the West, in the US and in Europe try to take to heart. It's not about America or Europe coming to fix us. It's about working with us to find the best way forward.
And Philip,
I think Donald Rumsfeld will be remembered in Europe for 2 things. One, his complete disregard to the need to sort of think carefully and plan and to consider, we were talking earlier about, as Kim was saying, for institutions. And when things go wrong, his famous phrase, stuff happens. Hey, who cares really? That hubristic So he'll be remembered for that. The other thing he'll be remembered for is his complete disdain for allies. I mean, I remember very well when Tony Blair was basically, risking his premiership on supporting the US, and he had a vote coming up in the House of Commons, and it was, it was all about standing with the United States. And Rumsfeld's response was, well, hey, we don't really need the Brits anyway. Who cares? And when NATO, as you remember, invoked Article 5 after the Afghan invasion, the US Rumsfeld response was, well, don't call us. And hey, we're not going to call you either.
Yeah, no, I think our more recent history in terms of Washington's relations with allies, we have forgotten how that history might have been in the early part of this century. It wasn't a very good one either. Let's switch, Kim, to Ethiopia. Because as Philip mentioned earlier, things really came to a head this week. And again, it's one of those countries, actually it's been reported a little more than perhaps in Lebanon, in part because of the atrocities are so tremendous and visible. And yet it is one of those countries and areas that tends to be ignored. But here there is both, internal and external collaboration on bringing a country to heels and making questions about leadership and who matters in the country. Bring us up to date about what's happening in the last few weeks in Ethiopia and the larger context in which it takes place.
Well, the rebel fighters in the northern Tigray region, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, now renamed themselves, I think, the Tigray Defense Forces, really stunned the world when they managed to retake the capital of that area, Mekele, after an 8-month-long campaign which the president of Ethiopia had launched, Abiy Ahmed. And they claim victory. Of course, Abiy's government has declared that they had withdrawn and declared a unilateral ceasefire. So to some extent, you have a problem of narrative there, but you also have a problem for both leaderships. Abiy's government now needs to decide how it's going to turn this narrative to its advantage, whether it's going to try to continue to sell this narrative to the world, whether it can even, because it's going to face the rebel fighters in Tigray who want to maintain not only their control over Mekele, but expand it and make sure that Eritrean forces, which also cross the border from the northern border into the Tigray area, leave as well. They are also responsible for atrocious abuses. And as you say, this is a conflict that spills over. This is a conflict in which Egypt has interest and Sudan have interest because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is a conflict in which the UAE, back to the Middle East, is involved diplomatically to some extent as well, because they're friends with Egypt, but they're also looking at what Abiy Ahmed is doing. Sudan has a stake in there. And so it was interesting to see that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, this week was speaking to leaders from the UAE about Ethiopia. It's hard to tell right now how this is going to unfold, but I think the most urgent thing is making sure the international community at least wants to make sure that aid can reach the Tigray region, because it's been an atrocious 8-month-long campaign, and we'll have to see how the two sides manage to move, to deal with the situation going forward.
And Philip, it's a deep-seated political conflict, of course, between Addis Ababa now, which used to be controlled by the Tigrayan leadership, now controlled by a different political force, a political force that was widely welcomed by the world when Abiy first came to power, because he settled the conflict with Eritrea and seemed to want to unite the country on more liberal and democratic efforts, and yet now 8 months long civil war against its own people, Tigrayan people in Ethiopia, and that's coming apart. How should we think about this conflict, and importantly, how should the international community relate to it, and what can it do?
I think the judgment certainly that's been made by the US and less publicly by the Europeans is that this particular crisis is what Abiy Ahmed's doing. I mean, he sent in the forces 8 months ago. I mean, Tigrayans are never going to accept, rule from Addis Ababa, and they're not innocents in this matter. And certainly in the war, since last November, there have been, it seems, atrocities on each side. But as you said, Ahmed 2 years ago was getting the Nobel Peace Prize for his action, and now has overreached. We've just had an election in Ethiopia, and we were waiting for the results. It's a partial election because it had to be avoided. I think now the pressure has to be from the United States and from Europe on the Ahmed government to say, if as people expect, he wins the election, that this has to be the point where the peace is remade with Tigray, and that the US has imposed some fairly light sanctions, I think, on individuals, and is holding up some government-to-government stuff. I think there has to be the prospect on the European side of some real pressure on the Ahmed government. But as Kim said, the really crucial thing is you've got hundreds of thousands of people on the edge of starvation in Tigray, and that aid has got to get in there, and there has to be real pressure for that to happen.
Julian, the issue has taken a hold in Washington. We have a special envoy for the region in order to try to engage. Kim mentioned that the issue is reaching the National Security Council and other folks. What's your sense of the strategy of the administration? Is it to try to, in the first instance, look at overcoming the humanitarian situation, but then in the second instance, to really see if there's a way out of the conflict and back on the road where it seemed to be Ethiopia was just 18 months ago?
I think that's right. The first and foremost is going to be the humanitarian questions. The key bridge blown up today or yesterday that's going to stop aid from going in. The Ethiopian government, even though they deny it, seems to be taking steps to stop that food and other supplies from getting in. And I think the pressure, first and foremost, is going to get the Ethiopian government to stop that, to allow the aid to come through, because you need that as a first step before you could have a diplomatic push. I mean, this does go to the issue of over-investing in individuals. He ended the war, he got the Peace Prize, he's a great hope. Well, the United States is better off when it invests in building up institutions and civil society movements as opposed to individuals, because here's a lesson of how it goes south. But the hope is that perhaps there are enough ties with the government to put the pressure on a peaceful resolution if you can get that humanitarian question answered in the next weeks.
Ivo, this is such a good point that Julian raises about America or Europe's investment in saviors. Key figures, whether it's Ashraf Ghani or Hamid Karzai, whether it's Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, it has to be back to this issue of governance. It has to be about institutions. It has to be about civil society. It has to be about, accountability. And, humans are fallible everywhere. We saw that in Donald Trump as well. And institutions are only as good as the people who run them. So not to belabor the point that we went over previously, but Julian raises this, it's easy to be disappointed. He got the Nobel Peace Prize, he made peace, etc. And suddenly he launches this campaign, this military campaign to to regain Tigray. I'm not saying that then the US should ditch him. That's also not the way to go. But to have a more overall, more holistic approach to some of these issues that don't rest on just one person. And I think that's a great piece of advice, which hopefully policymakers can keep in mind.
I think it's a very apt. I mean, there is this temptation to define countries in terms of the people who lead them, and yet it is the systemic nature of those countries that at the core is more important. Just as removing a Saddam Hussein doesn't fundamentally change the internal politics of Iraq, so supporting a Abiy Ahmed doesn't mean that Ethiopia's problems have been resolved forever because the fickleness of individuals. I think a very good point. Philip, you wanted to jump in on this, or? Oh, no. So because we have about 3 more minutes, and it's probably too much to ask to get a whole new thing going. But I do want, Philip, I want to get your reaction to something that was really missed, I think, in the coverage on the G7 and its aftermath, which is that the United States and Europe seem to be, on the one hand, creating a possibility for supporting critical industries and standards and guidance to compete effectively with China. And on the other hand, the very policies that the United States is announcing, and to some extent Europeans are announcing, are in competition with each other. The industrial policy that was laid out by Brian Deese, the National Economic Advisor to Biden, is seen by many in Europe as sort of a protectionist policy, a Buy America policy, and not really geared towards competition with China, effectively, at least bringing in allies in. Is this something that we're missing in the larger picture of the post-Biden, we're all back and we love each other kind of way, that there are deeper economic competitive pressures here that we ought to take a closer look at?
I'm going to be optimistic. Let's end on an optimistic note. Since the beginning of the Biden presidency, I think both the United States and Europe have understood that if they're going to have to compete with China, they're going to have to use their economic weight and use it together rather than compete and, if you like, leave the door open to a dominant China. We've seen Boeing and Airbus end a trade dispute that's been going on for 15 years. We've seen at the G7, Europe and the US leading the way to have a new global tax rate, minimum global corporate tax rate of 15%. And we've seen Europe and the US set up a new Trade and Technology Council. Now, let's be clear, Europe and the US will always compete economically. We have companies, you have companies, there'll always be governments on either side trying to privilege their own sides. But the purpose of alliances is not to have everyone agree, but to compromise sufficiently to ensure that the competition doesn't elbow out aside the cooperation. My optimistic take is, at the moment, we're seeing enough cooperative impulses to get us through these obvious, these inevitable squalls when one side or another does a bit to help out their guys. So yeah, it's not going to be smooth, but I think there is a real possibility that Europe and the US together can set, if you like, the terms, the rules for global technology and the next stage of, global, open global system. So there's my optimism.
Well, I love optimism. It's a great way to end the week. Julian, Kim, 10 seconds each. Do you share that optimism so that we can then also translate that cooperation in dealing with the issues that we have been dealt with? Or do you want to come back another time and say, let's have a debate about this? Kim?
I'm happy to share the optimism. The competition with China should bring Europe and the US together, and that competition is taking place in the Middle East as well. And in terms of, the other issue that we were talking about, governance and accountability, are important everywhere, in the US, in Europe, and also in the Middle East.
Absolutely. Julian, last word.
The last word is the reason why this may be different than before is China, and that there is a growing recognition that the pureness of competition is going to have to give way to a little bit of industrial policy if you don't want all of your semiconductor chips to be sucked up by China. So that's why I think the optimism for an agreement is merited.
And I think there's, as Philip said, that the structural argument is highlighted by the personalities. In this case, the people who are trying to lead it, they are naturally inclined to work together rather than against each other. And that's clearly what we saw also in the trip that Biden took to Europe. Kim Ghattas, Julian Barnes, Philip Stevens, thank you so much. Really fantastic conversation. Depressing, but with an optimistic end, which is the best way to go into the weekend for us here in the United States, a long weekend because of the celebration of our Independence Day. I wish everyone a happy weekend and a great July 4th. And we will be back next week with another edition of World Review when we look at the news from around the world. In the meantime, please join me in thanking our 3 panelists this week. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great to be there.
Great.